of this nightmare will forever darken the legacy of this generation of world leaders. All parties to the conflict continue to engage in action involving grave impact on civilians. My office has documented hundreds of airstrikes and ground-based strikes in 2017, which have killed thousands of civilians from across the country, at least a quarter of them children. Serious violations and abuses of human rights have been a significant driver of this conflict in Syria. And if it is to be sustainable, those seeking to bring badly needed peace to this country must ensure that it is grounded in international human rights standards. In Iraq, the defeat of ISIL forces in Mosul and Tal Afar has released hundreds of civilians from the brutal rule of this armed group. I urge the authorities to address the long-standing grievances of all ethnic and religious communities to promote reconciliation and stability. In Egypt, the state of emergency declared in April 2017 has been used to justify the systematic silencing of civil society and closure of civic space under the guise of countering terrorism. My office has received reports of oppressive measures, including increasing waves of arrests, arbitrary detention, blacklisting, travel bans, asset freezes, intimidation, and other reprisals against human rights defenders, journalists, political dissidents, and anyone affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood group. We are also receiving increased allegations of torture and detention, enforced disappearances, extrajudicial killings, and trials of civilians in military courts. The new NGO law adopted on the 24th of May, which comprehensively restricts the activities of civil society organizations, breaches international law as well as Egypt's own constitution. The government has further enacted sweeping blocks on hundreds of websites and media outlets, including those of Egyptian media and international NGOs. Since June 2016, the government of Bahrain has imposed severe restrictions on civil society and political activism through arrests, intimidation, travel bans, and closure orders, with increasing reports of torture by the security authorities. The democratic space in the country has essentially been shut down. I have repeatedly drawn the authorities' attention to the gravity of the situation in the kingdom, and I continue to offer the assistance of my office to any genuine effort to address the situation. Mr. President, last month my office issued a report on Venezuela highlighting excessive use of force by security officers and multiple other human rights violations in the context of anti-government protests. There is a very real danger that tensions will further escalate, with the government crushing democratic institutions and critical voices, including through criminal proceedings against opposition leaders, recourse to arbitrary detentions, excessive use of force and ill treatment of detainees, which in some cases amounts to torture. Venezuela is a member of this council and as such has a particular duty, and I quote, to uphold the highest standards in the promotion and protection of human rights, end quote, in the words of Resolution 60/251. My investigation suggests the possibility that crimes against humanity may have been committed, which can only be confirmed by a subsequent criminal investigation. And while I support the concept of a National Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the current mechanism is inadequate. I therefore urge that it be reconfigured with the support and involvement of the international community. I also urge this Council to establish an international investigation into the human rights violations in Venezuela. In the United States, I am concerned by the government's decision to end the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program in 6 months' time, despite evidence of its positive impact on the lives of almost 800,000 young immigrants and on the U.S. economy and society. I hope Congress will now act to provide former DACA beneficiaries with durable legal status. I am disturbed by the increase in detentions and deportations of well-established and law-abiding immigrants. The number of migrants detained who had no criminal convictions was 155% higher in the first 5 months of this year than in the equivalent period in 2016. Some migrants, including long-standing residents, are now so frightened of expedited deportation, they refrain from accessing police protection and courtrooms. For example, reports of rape by Latina women in Houston fell by 43% in the first 3 months of 2017. I have publicly expressed my concerns about the anti-Semitism and racism openly voiced in Virginia last month, and which is also increasingly manifested online and in public debates. Free speech is an invaluable and essential right under both international standards and US law, and it should not be weaponized by calls for violence and hatred. Mr. President, concern by Turkey's leadership for the human rights of the Rohingyas and others in foreign countries is deeply welcome. I encourage the government to exercise the same consideration for the human rights situation within Turkey, which continues to deteriorate. Rights to freedom of expression and information are under relentless pressure, with very large numbers of Turkish journalists, judges, academics, civil servants, and human rights defenders arrested and detained, and others dismissed or subjected to intrusive surveillance, censorship, threats, and violence. Individuals suspected of connections with non-state-approved religious movements or organizations that are left-wing or focus on Kurdish issues have also been targeted. Many of these measures appear disproportionate and may be arbitrary. The arrests this summer of 10 human rights defenders associated with Amnesty International, charged with aiding an armed terror organization for participating in a training workshop and conducting human rights work, suggest others may also be faced with abusive procedures. I call on the government to discontinue these practices, which undermine the vital force of an open, healthy, and free society. My office will soon release a report on the human rights consequences of the state of emergency, which I urge the government not to renew at the end of its term next month. In Poland, I applaud the activism of the thousands of people who in July protested for reforms of the judiciary which essentially aim to dismantle the basics of an independent judiciary, including by giving the government power to appoint and dismiss all judges and to immediately terminate the appointments of all members of the Supreme Court. Following the protests, President Duda vetoed 2 bills and returned them to Parliament. However, 2 others have entered into force, ensuring, among other key points, that the government can appoint and dismiss all presidents of regional tribunals who decide which judges preside over which cases. I deplore the government's increasingly visible control of key institutions, including the Constitutional Tribunal and national broadcast media. I urge the authorities to recall the Polish people's recent and magnificent history of struggle for human rights and liberty, and to respect, protect, and promote their rights to an independent judiciary, due process, independent media, and fundamental freedoms. At a time when migrants and refugees are facing hostility and inhumanity in many parts of Europe, the people of the tiny island of Tilos in Greece have shown it is entirely possible to welcome them in dignity and with respect. Despite the country's recession and severe cuts in public spending, municipal authorities, assisted by NGOs and many local volunteers, have taken in families requesting asylum and candidates for relocation to other EU countries, integrating the children in the local school and enabling adults to seek work. I honor and commend this example of human decency. Mr. President, Secretary General Guterres has appealed for a rational debate about migration in full respect for human rights. I very much hope the global compact on migration will result in migration governance that is better grounded in human rights. A month ago, several NGOs were compelled to limit or halt their life-saving activities in the central Mediterranean after the Libyan Coast Guard reportedly banned search and rescue operations in international waters near Libya and allegedly threatened any NGO that continued to rescue migrants. NGOs are now entering the area at their own risk. I call on Libya, the European Union and its member countries or member states to ensure that NGOs are not endangered in these rescues. They are saving the lives of considerable numbers of men, women, and children. I also repeat that impeding search and rescue, endangering migrants in distress at sea, and returning anyone to a place where they may face torture or other serious abuses would constitute a violation of obligations under the law of the sea and international human rights law. I am further appalled at the horrific abuses migrants face after being intercepted and returned to Libya. Extrajudicial killings, slavery, torture, rape, human trafficking, and starvation are only some of the reported abuses inflicted on migrants in both official and informal detention centers in the country. I remind all EU governments, and indeed all governments worldwide, that no human being may ever, under any circumstances, be deported to a place where he or she faces the likelihood of torture and human rights violations. Given the prevailing impunity and lawlessness in parts of Libya, I am extremely disturbed by recent reports suggesting that armed groups are now stopping and detaining migrants trying to leave the country, possibly with the encouragement of some member states of the EU. The EU and its member states must ensure that any cooperation agreement with Libya fully respects the rights and dignity of migrants. Mr. President, I'm deeply alarmed by the sharp deterioration in security conditions in large parts of the Central African Republic in recent months, especially in the southeast. I'm extremely concerned about persistent reports of atrocity crimes which are pushing the country very close to a complete breakdown along religious and ethnic lines. Increasing attacks against aid workers have forced a number of humanitarian organizations to suspend life-saving activities in parts of the country, and in recent months, tens of thousands of civilians have been forced to flee areas where violence is intensifying. Anti-Balaka and ex-Seleka forces, as well as various splinter groups, are responsible for the escalating cycles of reprisal attacks, which are fueled by incitement to hatred and violence by religious leaders and other leading figures. I urge public officials to promptly condemn all calls to violence. South Sudan is being quite simply destroyed by the devastating violence underway across much of the country. The Deputy High Commissioner will report to the Council in depth on the situation in South Sudan. She will also detail the concerns of my office regarding the situation in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where intercommunal violence, sometimes linked to the uncertain political situation, appears to be escalating in several parts of the country, including in the Tanganyika province and in North and South Kivu, in addition to the violations I've reported in the Kasai regions. The human rights situation in Burundi has in no way improved, as most recently was noted by the Commission of Inquiry on Burundi, with continuing reports of disappearances and killings, arbitrary arrests, detention and torture of perceived opponents. Most opposition parties, independent NGOs and media have been banned or suspended leaving virtually no space for civil liberties and open debate. The political impasse has had devastating impact on the economic